You asked me about the second mile, and look, Dennis, I guess what I will say to you is there's just certain things I can't talk about. That is one of them. What I can tell you as it relates to what we're doing now on second mile is that the second mile has about $750,000 worth of assets as they shut down as a charity, and we are working with the court to dispose of those assets in the proper way.
Now, that was Attorney General Josh Shapiro on this very program when asked about the second mile. It has been 7 years since the Jerry Sandusky child sex abuse scandal. Penn State's former assistant football coach is in prison. Several officials with the university were guilty of not doing enough to stop the abuse. The football team was slapped with sanctions. The school paid victims tens of millions of dollars and a fine. But what about the charity Sandusky founded and used to meet and groom nearly all of his victims? Some say the second mile has not been held accountable, including our guest Ray Blehar, a former intelligence analyst who believes there was actually a conspiracy to blame Penn State for Sandusky and deflect attention perhaps away from the second mile. Full disclosure, you are a grad. You get your MBA from Penn State,
That's
that correct?
Right. I went back to school at age 45 and graduated.
Well, congratulations on that.
Thanks.
What is your basic argument as this whole scandal pertains to the second mile?
Well, I think the Attorney General's narrative of a Penn State cover-up obscured the fact that there were so many other organizations involved, including the second mile, who failed to stop Jerry Sandusky when they had a chance. As it turned out, everybody has the belief that everybody at Penn State had to know Jerry Sandusky was a pedophile, and that argument seems to be prevailing at Michigan State, where everybody had to know Larry Nassar was a pedophile, but that's simply not true, and that everybody at Penn State was fooled by Jerry Sandusky, and there was really no cover-up.
But let's talk about the second mile, because that's where you believe that they haven't been held properly accountable.
That's correct. And part of the narrative here is, or what part of the problem is what I'll call conflation or confusion over the roles of various agencies and organizations in this case. The second mile had a much more higher legal standard of responsibility.
Because they had child psychologists, and they were actually supposed to be overseeing the kids.
Right, they're overseeing the welfare of children. Yeah. So there are certain rules that they should have in place to make sure kids are protected at all times, understand what's appropriate contact between adults and children and what's not appropriate. And in second mile, none of these rules existed. And even when things were brought up about Jerry's inappropriate conduct, they did nothing.
And some people might be saying, right, the second mile is closed. You can't get blood out of a stone. Move on. What's the big deal?
Well,
it's been shut down. What more do you want?
Well, if that was the case, Dennis, then the IRS could never prosecute anybody for tax evasion. They'd simply close their business and move on, right? And say, hey, we don't do this anymore. No, there are people who were part of the second mile. You prosecute individuals, not organizations. And there are those at the charity, like Dr. Jack Rakowitz, who clearly didn't do enough, and in his case, didn't do the legal minimum when he received a report about Jerry Sandusky in 2001 and again in 2009.
And we reached out to him to see if he would comment for today's program. I think the only time he has commented is when he was under oath at one of the hearings.
He's made a few comments to newspapers, but yes, for the most part on the record, he's testified at the grand jury and at the Spaniard trial.
Now, we have a comment from then Attorney General candidate Josh Shapiro, and we should be clear, all of this happened before Josh Shapiro became Attorney General. Much of this happened, I should say. But here's what he said as a candidate when specifically asked about the second mile. Take a look at this.
I think we need to follow the evidence wherever it leads, whether it leads to second mile or any other organization. No one will be off limits if I'm Attorney General.
So what do you make of that comment as a candidate, and then the comment we began the segment with, now that he is Attorney General, saying there's things I can't talk about? What do you make of all of that?
Well, clearly there's favoritism involved, and if you believe in equal justice under the law, then Josh Shapiro isn't your man. Because at the Spaniard trial, Jack Rakowitz took the stand, and he testified he was told about Sandusky's ban from the Penn State locker room. He didn't inquire as to the identity of the child, which Penn State was raked over the coals for by the Attorney General's office. Jack Rakowitz did nothing to prevent Jerry Sandusky from accessing children after that in 2001. In fact, prosecutor Laura Ditka made the case that in order for evil to triumph, it's that good men do nothing. Well, the three Penn State officials who faced charges at least
Face charges.
Faced and in two cases, one was convicted and two pleaded guilty.
Yeah.
At least they looked into the case and they reported it outside to the Second Mile in 2001. The Second Mile did absolutely nothing.
What do you make of the general malaise or not sense of urgency to go after Second Mile?
Well, contrary to what the media might report, this is all about politics.
Meaning?
Well, when Jeffrey Moulton conducted his investigation back in 2014, he made a statement. He said, there's no direct evidence that electoral politics played a role in the pace of the Sandusky scandal. Well, that was morphed by the media into politics didn't play a role in the Sandusky investigation. But clearly it did, because one, Senator Jake Corman was a member of the board of the Second Mile at the fateful time they made the 2009 decision. And two, unless you believe in amazing coincidences, the anonymous tip that led to Mike McQuarrie happened one day after Tom Corbett was elected. That's simply not a coincidence.
So, and we should be clear, this is not, the things you're talking about is not Josh Shapiro, Attorney General. They're Tom Corbett, Attorney General, who was running for governor at the time.
That's correct. However, Josh Shapiro did his victory lap when he convicted Spanier, and his prosecutors take the victory lap for the conviction of Jerry Sandusky. So if he wants to take credit for the good things that happened, he has to also take credit for the bad things that happened.
Before we go, we're almost out of time. There are critics that say, Ray Blehar, you're just trying to deflect attention away from the negative press that Penn State and Penn State football and Joe Paterno got, and that's why you're pushing this Second Mile angle. What do you say to that?
Well, if you believe that if Pennsylvania's children are any safer than they are now than they were in 2001 when Paterno got the report, than they were back then, you're mistaken.
So there hasn't been meaningful enough change in your mind to protect kids when it comes to any kind of kids' charities?
Absolutely not.
And that's something that needs to happen moving forward in your view?
Absolutely. The legislature blew it when they changed the laws after the PHS Task Force on Child Protection. They focused simply on reporting and penalties when in fact they should have been focusing on prevention.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I have a feeling there's lots more conversation to be had, but we're out of time. Ray, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Sure do appreciate it.
Thanks for
Stay
having
with
me.
us. More This Week in Pennsylvania.